There has been much scrutiny over the media coverage of the 11-month war, a war started by Hamas on the 7th of October. The BBC anti-Israel bias sparking much outrage in this part of the world and elsewhere. It doesn't refer to Hamas as a terror group, even though it's designated as such in the UK. Now, a report conducted by a British law firm finding that the BBC had breached its own editorial guidelines more than 1,500 times during its war coverage so far. That coverage associates Israel with genocide over 14 times more than Hamas, the group that conducted the terror rampage and mass abduction, and today continues holding 101 people hostage in Gaza. So for more, we welcome live from London, Trevor Asserson, founder and senior partner at Asserson Law Offices and the head of this research project. Trevor, thank you so much for joining us today. So there are staggering examples of anti-Israel bias through the lens of the BBC, infuriating and upsetting many, all while Hamas leaders vow to repeat October 7th style attacks again and again. The BBC associates Israel with genocide. Your report has specific numbers. So to start, tell us how this research was conducted, analysing some 9 million words of BBC content. Tell us more.
Okay, thank you. I am a litigation solicitor. That's my background. And what I did when I heard that various people felt the BBC wasn't getting this story right is I used my litigation experience to decide that I should put together the material that could possibly be used to bring a claim against the BBC for breach of its actual regulations and its own rules, which under which it operates. And so I recorded all the BBC principal news output for a period of 4 months. And then I hired a team of external lawyers to analyse what amounted to be about 9 million words of, as you said, of both UK broadcasting in English and also Arab BBC Arabic. And what we did is we tried to classify the extent to which the BBC had actually complied with its obligations of impartiality. Simultaneously with that, a group of mostly Israeli-based data scientists, including professors from the Hebrew University and Ben Gurion University, under the leadership of Haran Shani-Narkis, put together an analysis and a whole load of experiments so that we could analyze this work from a deep data perspective using data science tools. This is something quite novel, so that not only were we able to use traditional legal methods, but we were also able to combine that with the deep data, dive into this.
Right.
And as a result, we were able to substantiate each approach substantiated the other and gave it further strength.
Astounding to think that in the face of the October 7th massacre, the BBC has managed to downplay the Hamas brutality and the depravity, much of which was, of course, all filmed by terrorists themselves. So you're talking about this novel way that you analyze the content. What are some of the examples that stood out for you in terms of their coverage?
Some of the most remarkable examples were on October the 7th itself, which was a day in which the news around the world was sympathetic to Israel, that had suffered the worst brutal attack there's probably ever been seen in the world, because this was all filmed by the perpetrators as they were performing these horrendous acts. The sympathy in BBC Arabic was greater for the Palestinians than it was for the Israelis who were being attacked, and that's an extraordinary thing. Another extraordinary fact is that Hamas, as you said, a prescribed terrorist organization, is more likely to be described by the BBC as a health ministry than it is as a prescribed terrorist organization. We measured the way in which some of the main outlets in British news, the Newsnight, Breakfast TV, and one other channel were looking at the crisis, at the war, and they were at times 90 or 95, even 100% of their non-neutral coverage was anti-Israel. There's fact after fact. In order to make the 200-page report a little easier to read, we put in a lot of pictures, a lot of graphs, so that some of these facts really leap off the page. Another fact, which is absolutely extraordinary, we looked at the corrections the BBC made. That is to say, where the BBC itself admitted that it had got the story wrong.
Right.
And there, 100% of the major errors were really quite viciously anti-Israel stories, which were totally untrue.
And again, you made mention of the fact regarding the numbers, the figures coming out of Gaza, crediting numbers that were attributed to Hamas, the terror group who conducted the rampage in the first place. Trevor, how does the BBC get away with this? This isn't a campus radio station, it's the BBC. What happens next in terms of multiple breaches of its own editorial guidelines?
Yes. Well, I'm quite sure that there are many campus radio stations that are doing a much better job at accurate reporting than the BBC.
Fair point.
And you're absolutely right to ask that question. How do they get away with it? And the answer is that people haven't actually done the one thing that needs to be done, unfortunately, which is to bring a claim against them for breach of their own rules. They are getting £4 billion from the British population through the license fee, which many people are upset about, because people who really don't support the BBC, don't even watch the BBC, are forced to pay this money to an organisation. The only real excuse that the BBC has for being allowed to receive this money is that they will provide balanced, impartial news. And frankly, if they totally fail to do that, then they're really breaching their contract with the British people. And of course, the effects of that breach are felt around the world, not least in Israel, which is where I live, which is where my law firm sits, and where we as a firm are, all of us, deeply troubled and upset by what has actually been going on at the BBC.
It certainly is very troubling indeed, and as you say, has implications here and elsewhere. Is there a credible media watchdog or the like to sanction the broadcaster over this? What has the response been like so far to your report?
Well, the response to our report has actually been very gratifying and almost overwhelming. The number of people who feel very encouraged that finally, having believed that the BBC was really breaching its obligations, they've got in their hands absolute proof that that's the case, that their suspicions were right. And that's the media watch that has really been conducted by us, and it will form, I believe, the foundation for taking this further. Either the BBC will take a mature approach to the report and accept that it has been getting the story wrong and start to try to actually put its house in order. Sadly, I think that the chances of that are slim to nil, because in the past the BBC has been very, very bad at recognising its own defects. And if that's not the case, then we're going to have to go to the British court, just as in Israel, where the courts are independent and are able to criticise government bodies. Similarly, as in all liberal democracies, in England also, the courts have the authority to be independent of government and government-funded bodies and to criticise them. So we can, I think, rely on an independent judge to look at the facts that we have assembled and to see that there is a fundamental and ongoing breach by the BBC of its obligations.
And obviously the concern about that kind of bias isn't only focused on the BBC. If we looked abroad in the US, you had a news anchor rolling her eyes as relatives of hostages were interviewed. Perhaps your next research can extend globally. Very briefly, is this kind of research going to extend to other broadcasters too?
Well, what I can tell you is that I'm launching a campaign for media for media standards that is going to produce another report, a separate report to mine, which will also demonstrate massive failures by the BBC over time, looking at a significant period of coverage during this war. Whether or not we extend that, we go on to extend that to other news broadcasters is something which is definitely being borne in mind. It is a terrible problem that the media is irresponsibly reporting this story, like so many other stories. I don't want to suggest that the Israel-Hamas war is the only story in the world that is being badly reported. Bad news is bad for democracy, it's bad for liberal society, it's bad for the people that consume that news. And journalists really need to have their responsibilities, they need to take their responsibilities seriously. They can have an effect on society, they can have a very damaging effect in all sorts of ways, and major political decisions can be made on the basis of bad news. So we're trying to take a step in the right direction. We're hoping that we can call the BBC to account and effect the change that's so desperately needed.
A fascinating issue, such an important conversation. Thank you so much for your insights. Trevor Asserson, live on i24 News. Thank you so much for being with us on The Rundown.
Thank you.